You people only know how to bow your heads. Law is my business, Lieutenant Doyle snarled as he dragged a black woman out of a supermarket, slapping handcuffs on her right in front of the crowd. He didn't check her ID, didn't read her rights. The officer simply looked at the military jacket she wore and accused her of impersonation. Arrogant and reckless, he had no idea the woman he was humiliating was Major General Adrian Lane, the commander behind the Syria campaign. Her comeback had the power to shake the entire system. Where do you live? If you saw this happen, would you stay silent or speak up? The fluorescent lights of the grocery store flickered against polished tile floors, humming low like a tension waiting to break. Officer Doyle was halfway through his coffee when he saw her. She moved past the cereal aisle, smooth, deliberate, wearing a military-style jacket with patches he didn't immediately recognize, but that didn't matter. It had the cut, the posture, the implication. He narrowed his eyes. Her steps didn't flinch when she reached for a can of beans. That calm, too calm, rubbed him wrong. His pulse picked up. He didn't care for mysteries, especially not ones dressed in authority. He clicked his radio. "Control, I've got a possible impersonation. Military uniform, female, aisle 5. I'm checking now." He raised the volume, not because he needed backup, but because he wanted her to hear it. He watched her head turn, just slightly, not startled, aware. He stepped closer. She reached for a boxed meal labeled with a clear veteran support logo, slid it into her basket, then turned as if to move on. Doyle closed in. "Excuse me, ma'am," he barked, hand hovering near his hip. "I need to ask you some questions about that jacket." She looked at him. No smile, no fear. Just a steady gaze that hit his nerves like sandpaper. "Got some concerns about military impersonation. Happens more than people think," he added, louder now, as if the echo might validate him. She didn't respond, only adjusted her grip on the basket and tilted her head just slightly. That irritated him more than if she'd screamed. "Do you have ID on you?" he pressed, already moving closer than protocol allowed. "Verification of service, rank, anything?" She didn't hand him anything. She didn't offer a defense. She stood still, face unreadable, eyes locked. Her silence was infuriating, defiant. That jacket didn't belong on someone who thought silence could protect them. Doyle glanced at her basket again, that veteran support box. Too convenient. Too staged. "Ma'am, I'm gonna need to look through your bag." He didn't ask. He just reached. No warrant, no probable cause. A voice whispered in the back of his mind, but he drowned it in a rush of authority. He yanked her tote open, scanned its contents with mechanical judgment, a wallet, receipts, and keys. Nothing out of line, that only made it worse. With a flick of his thumb, he pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is Officer Doyle of Metro Police. I am detaining this individual on suspicion of military impersonation. Evidence includes fraudulent veteran-branded goods and unverified uniform wear. This is a matter of national respect and law enforcement integrity." She didn't move, didn't cover her face. Her expression didn't even flicker. That, more than anything, gnawed at him. He reached for his cuffs, metal clinking with purpose. "Turn around." She did, slowly, calmly, like someone who'd done it before. She offered her wrists, palms out, fingers relaxed, and then came the moment that would haunt him long after. Her eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She didn't explain. She looked at him as if she were watching a child spill paint on a priceless canvas. Disappointed, but not surprised. He clicked the cuffs over her wrists, tighter than necessary. Still, she didn't react. "Anything to say for yourself?" he muttered, already annoyed that no crowd was forming, that she hadn't made this dramatic enough to justify his aggression. She remained silent. That silence, it wasn't passive, it was intentional, designed. It clawed at him, colder than handcuffs, sharper than a reprimand. In that small space between the freezer aisle and the impulse racks of gum and soda, something shifted. He thought he had control. He thought he'd cornered a liar. Instead, he stood cuffing a woman who hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made a plea, hadn't blinked wrong, and yet somehow she was the one watching him burn, from the inside out. He pressed the radio again. One in custody, transporting for further verification. She stood straight as he guided her toward the exit, wrists secured behind her, head high. He glanced at the other shoppers, searching for approval, for alarm, for something to validate his action. But they just watched, curious, unsure, disinterested. Not one stepped forward. As they stepped into the parking lot, the wind tugged at her hair, but she didn't break stride. Her boots hit the concrete in even tempo, like a march. A soldier's rhythm. That irritated him more than he could admit. He hated how quiet she was, hated that he couldn't shake her. She sat in the back of the cruiser without complaint, eyes forward, lips sealed. He started the engine, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. He checked the rearview mirror. She was still watching him, but not with fear, not with submission, like she was timing something. The cuffs tightened slightly when she shifted her weight, but she made no noise. Doyle reached for the dashboard cam switch. It was already on. He told himself he had the upper hand, but his throat was dry, and her silence had already carved its way into his nerves like a fault line. And though he'd never admit it, as he pulled onto the street, sirens off, lights off, just a man with a badge and a theory, he felt something he didn't often think in uniform. Doubt, and it was wearing a jacket he couldn't understand. He pulled into the station with the swagger of a man who thought he'd just delivered a head on a silver platter. The cruiser door slammed. He circled to the back, yanked it open, and gestured with 2 fingers. "Out," he ordered, not even bothering to look at her face. But she stepped out with the same unbroken composure she wore inside the store. She didn't resist, didn't stumble. She moved like someone walking through fog, untouched by the chaos around her. It only made him more resolute. They walked through the side entrance, her boots tapping with a cadence that grated on him like a metronome he couldn't silence. No panic, no shame, just that maddening stillness. She wasn't cuffed to protect anyone from her. She was cuffed because he needed her to look like a suspect. At the booking desk, he announced with a tone soaked in pride, another fraudster thinking they can wear valor like a costume, threw herself into the trap. He didn't whisper. He wanted every officer in earshot to catch it. He wanted the statement to echo. He wanted this woman's silence buried under the weight of his narrative. He wrote the report himself. He didn't let the desk sergeant touch it. This wasn't just paperwork. It was theater. He scribbled with flair, underlining the threat to the integrity of the armed forces' perception and inserting the phrase, misrepresentation of service to manipulate public trust. His pen dug into the page like a knife, carving a legend in ink. He signed it with a flourish. His handwriting was sloppy but bold, just like the man himself. After printing the booking photo, he took a copy for himself. She was sitting in the chair, wrists cuffed, head slightly tilted, eyes looking straight into the camera without fear or apology. That look, it irritated him. She wasn't broken, she wasn't angry, she wasn't begging. He tacked the picture onto the corkboard in the break room with a thumbtack and scrawled a line underneath in marker, law enforced with an iron fist. He stepped back and admired it like a trophy. A fresh officer walked in, barely out of the academy, and raised an eyebrow. "Who's that?" he asked. Doyle smirked. "One more idiot who thought a military patch makes you untouchable." The rookie hesitated, then asked, "She say anything when you picked her up?" Doyle's grin twisted into something colder, crueler. "Didn't say a word, just stared at me, like she was giving orders without opening her mouth." He let that hang, savoring the dramatic silence. The young officer blinked. Uneasy. Doyle liked that. Fear was fuel. Respect wasn't demanded, it was engineered. Down and holding, she sat in the chair with her back straight, hands now free but resting in her lap. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her, pale and merciless. There was nothing in the room. No clock, no mirror, no sound. Just her and the walls. And yet she looked as if she were exactly where she needed to be. She adjusted the collar of her jacket. A tiny motion, almost invisible. But Doyle, watching through the glass, caught it. She wasn't fidgeting, she was preparing, as if she had somewhere to be, as if this were an appointment, not a detention. He leaned into the intercom and pressed the button. "You want to talk yet?" he said, voice edged with sarcasm. No answer. Not even a glance at the glass. She simply shifted her posture slightly. Chin rising, gaze fixed ahead, not on him. That made his jaw tighten. He walked away from the viewing station, the soles of his boots striking the floor too hard. Each step said control, command, dominion. But inside, something churned. Her lack of reaction felt like an attack, like a strategy, and Doyle didn't like to play defense. He returned to his desk, opened the internal case log, and uploaded the clip he'd recorded at the store. Civilian female detained under suspicion of military impersonation. Subject displayed signs of premeditated deception, including possession of items marked for veteran support, and was non-compliant during verbal queries. He paused, hovering over the keyboard. The word non-compliant bothered him. It wasn't accurate. She hadn't defied him, she had simply refused to acknowledge his performance. He changed it to unresponsive in a manner indicating concealment of identity. That felt better. He hit save. In the hallway, a group of officers passed by, mid-shift change. One nodded toward the break room bulletin board. "You put that up?" someone asked. Doyle chuckled. "Damn right I did. Let everyone know this isn't a joke. We're not letting clowns wear the uniform and walk free." "She doesn't look like a clown," one of them muttered, almost too soft to hear. Doyle's smile twitched. "You got something to say, Martinez?" he asked. The younger cop shrugged. "No, sir." "Good." Doyle's voice was ice now, because respect for the uniform means not letting it be dragged through the mud. He turned the corner fast, heart pounding with adrenaline. This was the kind of incident that got press. The kind that reminded people cops were still on the front lines of honor, or so he told himself. He checked in on the holding room again. She hadn't moved, still upright, still silent, still carrying herself like someone who didn't recognize his authority. That burned more than anything. He'd expected anger, tears, protest. What he got was a stillness that undermined everything he said. He walked in. She didn't flinch. He pulled out a chair across from her and sat down, leaning forward. "You think silence buys you anything? You think staring like that makes you look strong? It doesn't. It makes you look like a coward hiding behind silence." She blinked once. Slowly, nothing else. Doyle's knuckles whitened against the edge of the table. "Say something, defend yourself." Still, nothing. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping backward. "Fine, don't talk. But you're going on record, and this will be one hell of a footnote on your file. Whatever fake name you're using." She turned her head then, just a little. Not fast, not slow, just enough to let her eyes meet his. They didn't flare, they didn't accuse, but in that quiet stare, Doyle saw something worse than judgment. He saw discipline, measured power, a refusal to engage in anything beneath her. He hated how it made him feel. He walked out again, the room colder now than when he entered. The holding cell door shut behind him, the lock clanking like a final word. But the silence inside hadn't changed. If anything, it had deepened. Later that night, he passed the break room again. Her photo still hung on the board, staring back at him. He stood there for a moment, eyes locked on it. "Just a faker," he muttered under his breath. "Just another faker." But his voice didn't carry the conviction it had hours earlier. And somewhere behind that glass wall, Adrienne Lane, still unnamed to him, still silent, was waiting. Not for his question, not for his apology, but for the right time. And the moment was getting close. The morning air hung thick with tension, though the sky above the courthouse was unnervingly clear. Doyle arrived early, not because he was required to, but because he wanted his stride measured, confident, borderline theatrical. To be seen, his shoes struck the marble steps with purpose. He carried the file like a badge of honor. Inside it, the clip he'd filmed himself, looped, and trimmed to present his version of the truth. It was, in his mind, more than enough. It was Exhibit A in the performance of righteousness he intended to deliver. Inside, the courtroom hummed with quiet bureaucracy. Paper shuffled, pens clicked, legal aides whispered without conviction. No media frenzy, no packed benches, just the static gravity of law settling into its daily rhythm. And yet, Doyle walked in like a headliner. He handed over the USB to the court clerk with a smirk. "Relevant evidence, captured on scene," he said, voice laced with self-satisfaction. He adjusted his cuffs, ran a hand down the front of his uniform, and took his seat at the witness bench. Legs crossed, expression locked in what he thought was composed authority. Then she entered. Adrienne walked in without announcement, without an escort, without a single word. She moved with the restraint of someone trained not to waste energy. She wore the same jacket, creased but pristine. Her hands were free, her steps exact, her posture a silent war drum. She took her seat in the front row of the courtroom gallery, not as a defendant, but as a presence. She looked forward, spine straight. Unmoved by the glances she drew, she didn't scan the room. She didn't look at him. Her stillness was deliberate, unshaken, almost ceremonial. Doyle noticed the quiet that followed her in. It wasn't reverent, it was dense, as if the air itself recognized her authority before anyone else did. The bailiff announced the judge's entrance, and proceedings began. The courtroom stood and sat in sync. The judge, an older man with eyes honed sharp from decades of hearing truth bent into fiction, looked first at the paperwork, then at the room, then finally at Adrienne. "The matter before us concerns an accusation of military impersonation. Alleged evidence submitted by Officer Nathan Doyle. Defendant, Adrienne Lane." She didn't flinch. The judge tilted his head slightly. "Ms. Lane, do you have legal representation present today?" She spoke for the first time. Not loud, not soft, but clear enough to cut the air. "No, Your Honor." "Do you wish to make a statement in your defense?" Adrienne paused. Not to calculate, not to rehearse, only to honor the weight of the silence before the strike. "No, sir." That was all. She said it with such calm finality that it echoed louder than any protest. Doyle shifted, irritated. His moment was being diluted by her refusal to engage. The judge turned toward Doyle. "Officer, the floor is yours." Doyle straightened. This was the part he'd prepared for. His voice rose with the cadence of self-importance. "Your Honor, I submit that the individual in question was observed wearing military identifying apparel in a public setting, procuring goods marked for veterans. In my judgment, such behavior constitutes a deliberate misrepresentation of service, which, if left unchecked, undermines the very fabric of our respect for those who serve honorably." He stopped, waiting to be interrupted. No one did. He continued, louder, feeling the vacuum of attention fill with his rhetoric. "We live in a time where symbols matter, where the uniform stands as both shield and standard. Allowing civilians to flaunt false service erodes public trust and insults the men and women who've earned their decorations through sacrifice." His voice sharpened. "I acted within the scope of preserving that honor. I acted with the intent to prevent this breach from festering into a wider trend of mockery. We must make clear that impersonation is not fashion, it is fraud, and fraud against the uniform is fraud against the nation." There was silence when he finished. Not applause, not disdain, just silence. He'd expected murmurs of agreement. He got stillness. He glanced at Adrienne, hoping finally to provoke some kind of reaction. She turned her head, just enough to look at him. It was the first time their eyes had met in that room, and it undid him. There was no anger in her gaze, no fury, no plea for justice. What she gave him was colder, quieter, a stare sculpted from years of discipline, forged in rooms more dangerous than this, where words were weapons and silence was strategy. She looked at him as one would regard a child mid-tantrum, curious, but fundamentally unimpressed, and beneath that stare, Doyle felt his armor splinter. The judge looked between the two of them, eyebrows raised. "No further testimony?" he asked Adrienne. She turned back, gazing forward. "No, Your Honor." The judge leaned back in his chair. "Remarkable." Doyle blinked. "Excuse me?" I said. "Remarkable," the judge repeated, voice cool. "How few words have been spoken, and yet the air is thick with narrative." He tapped a few notes on his pad, then looked up. "This court will review the video evidence and documentation submitted. However, the court also recognizes the rights of individuals to refrain from self-incrimination and their choice not to respond to unproven allegation." Doyle opened his mouth, but there was nothing left for him to say. Adrian stood as the judge dismissed the hearing for recess. She didn't glance at Doyle again. She didn't smirk, didn't soften. She simply walked out of the courtroom the same way she had walked in, composed, efficient, and entirely unaffected. Doyle remained seated, lips tight, fingers curled on the bench. He looked around, realizing he wasn't the hero in the room. He wasn't even the story. The courtroom hadn't moved in minutes. It remained suspended in that peculiar kind of silence that comes when one presence exits and the air doesn't quite know how to refill the space. Doyle still sat on the bench, jaw clenched, watching the doors through which Adrienne had disappeared. He told himself she was running, that silence was cowardice, that he'd just unmasked a fraud on record. But something about the stillness unsettled him. It didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like restraint. And restraint, when wielded right, was another kind of power. The judge returned after recess with the pace of someone who had just seen more than expected. His gavel tapped once, not to demand silence, but to cut through the kind that already gripped the room like frost on glass. "Ms. Lane," he began without ceremony, "before we proceed further, I have one question to clarify a key matter." Adrienne had returned to her seat in the front row. Posture flawless, jacket buttoned to the top, eyes forward. She didn't blink when her name was spoken. She only tilted her chin slightly, acknowledgement without deference. The judge leaned forward, elbows on the bench, fingers locked. "Did you ever serve in the United States military?" The room held its breath, not because they were unsure of her answer, but because they suddenly realized how little they knew of her. All that silence, all that poise. It had hinted at something, but no one had dared to name it, not yet. Adrienne didn't speak right away. She reached instead into her satchel, careful, deliberate, with the economy of motion that only someone trained in high-risk environments could command. She pulled out a thick envelope, blood red, embossed with a raised insignia and sealed with a Department of Defense stamp so crisp it looked freshly pressed. She stood, slowly holding the envelope like an artifact, not a prop. "I asked the court," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel, "to review this document in full." The bailiff approached, took the envelope with both hands and delivered it to the judge. He broke the seal, unfolded the contents and scanned them line by line. He didn't speak, didn't move, just read. When he reached the bottom, he adjusted his glasses, looked up, and then did something Doyle did not expect. He cleared his throat with sudden formality, as if the tone of the entire proceeding had just shifted from procedural to ceremonial. "For the record," the judge said, voice echoing now, "this court has received and verified a military summons, issued under Clearance Code Alpha 27, dated last month, addressed to Major General Adrienne Lane, United States Army. The document identifies Ms. Lane as an active officer under the direct authority of the Department of Defense, with full honors and security classification." Doyle froze. He didn't move, but something inside him cracked. His fingers twitched. The USB he had fumbled with earlier slipped from his hand and clattered against the wooden floor, a sharp sound that echoed far louder than it should have. No one reached for it. No one moved to help. The silence that followed wasn't theatrical. It was terminal. It was the kind of silence that came at the end of a story, not the middle. The kind that didn't wait for applause, because it knew none was necessary. Adrienne hadn't moved. Her eyes didn't glow with triumph. Her lips didn't curl. She remained composed, regal without arrogance, proud without performance. She didn't look at Doyle. She didn't need to. But the courtroom did. Dozens of eyes turned toward him now, not with admiration, not even with anger, but with the cold curiosity reserved for men who had overstepped, spoken too loudly, and now stood naked before the consequences of their volume. Doyle cleared his throat, but his voice didn't follow. The judge didn't speak either. He turned to Adrienne, his tone stripped of anything informal. "General Lane, do you wish to respond?" She stood fully now, and finally, for the first time since the beginning, she turned to face Doyle directly. Her eyes didn't burn, they didn't judge, they dismissed. And then she spoke, just one sentence, delivered like a verdict. "Check my military rank first, please." Then she sat down. No sound followed, no pen scratch, no whisper. The entire courtroom had become a vacuum, devoured by the weight of realization. Doyle, once so loud, now sat silent. Even he knew any protest now would land like a child crying over spilled lies. He glanced around the room, hoping for a lifeline, a nod of agreement, some shared outrage, but there was none. He had shouted into a storm, and now he stood soaked and ridiculous. The clerk reached for the court's transcript file, marking the words down not just as spoken text, but as the moment the narrative inverted entirely. No longer was Adrienne Lane the woman in question. She had become the standard. The room reoriented itself around her. Everyone could feel it. The judge nodded once and announced the recess would be extended for further procedural review. Adrienne did not linger. She rose, collected her documents, and exited without a spectacle. Her boots echoed with the same precise rhythm as before. She did not look back. Doyle remained seated, sweating through his shirt, hands balled on his knees. The USB lay on the floor, forgotten. It wasn't evidence anymore. It was debris. And in that courthouse, something irreversible had happened. Not with drama, not with shouts, but with a red envelope and the quiet fury of a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to make a nation stop and listen. The words didn't echo. They detonated. Not with sound, but with velocity. By the time Adrienne Lane's boots touched the courthouse stairs, a nearby journalist had uploaded the courtroom's transcript. 6 words, coldly precise, surgically restrained. "Check my military rank first, please." In a world addicted to outrage and overstatement, the nation didn't know what to do with such a chilling economy. It didn't need context, it didn't need spin, it demanded silence. And got viral. Within hours, the clip surfaced online, edited clean, no background noise, no names, no commentary, just her voice, calm and slow, followed by the judge's pause, the reveal, and Doyle's trembling hand dropping the USB like a toy gun misfired. The internet didn't debate it, it crowned it. The video racked up 7 million views in 12 hours. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was surgical. People shared it with a single caption. "This is how power walks in." News outlets scrambled to catch up. By dawn, national anchors recited her words like scripture. A segment on CNN titled "The Woman in Uniform" broke down her body language. Fox News ran a heated panel asking, why didn't the officer know? But the deeper they dug, the harder the silence hit. Adrienne Lane had no social media presence. No Twitter trail, no Instagram selfies, no LinkedIn endorsements, just records. And those told a different story. It began with a scan of a military dispatch from 4 years ago. Operation Halberd. Location, U.S. Embassy, Damascus, Syria. Objective, evacuation and defense under siege. Commander on record, Lane, A.J. rank, Brigadier General. Then another surfaced, video footage from a Defense Department archive. Adrienne, covered in dust, barking orders into a cracked comms unit while mortar fire lit the sky behind her. That clip didn't go viral, it went sacred. By midday, retired General Marcus Belton appeared on national television, face stern, voice deliberate. "I served under her, and let me make this clear," he said, eyes locked on the camera. "General Lane didn't just issue orders. She ended wars with words. That officer didn't detain a civilian. He tried to arrest a battlefield ghost with clearance 10 layers above his pay grade." The backlash against Doyle was immediate and merciless. His once brash Facebook page, where he'd posted "Uphold the badge" or "Get out of the way," turned into a digital graveyard. People scoured his past posts. clipping out every quote dripping with false bravado and lining them up beside Adrienne's haunting silence. He tried to post a defense. It read, "I had no way of knowing who she was. I was only doing my job." The likes stalled in the double digits. The comments shredded him alive. "You had no way of knowing because you never shut up long enough to ask," someone replied. Another wrote, "Doing your job doesn't include harassing a decorated warfighter buying groceries." Doyle deleted the post within the hour, but it was too late. Screenshots floated like ash through the algorithm. Adrienne, for her part, did nothing. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't write a statement. She didn't even blink into the media cyclone she had triggered. The nation looked to her for clarity and got silence. And somehow that silence said more than Doyle's entire record of noise. She had become a cipher of gravity, a woman who commanded not through access, but absence. Her silence spread like a doctrine. It left Doyle with no surface to attack, no words to twist, no heat to convert into fuel. Just the echo of his arrogance reverberating back at him. At the precinct, Doyle's photo wall came down, quietly. No order, no notice. Just one of the younger officers, Martinez, pulling it off the corkboard and dropping it into the trash bin. The photo of Adrienne in cuffs crumpled like paper never meant to be history. No one spoke. No one defended. The station break room, once Doyle's theater of false triumph, became a vacuum of embarrassed memory. On Reddit, a thread titled 6 Words, 1 Ghost climbed to the front page. Veterans posted comments full of awe and shame. She was my CO in Mosul. Her call sign was Iron Widow. I watched her walk through crossfire like it was paperwork. No sarcasm, no hyperbole, just reverence sharpened by regret. Everyone asked the same thing in 1,000 ways. How did no one see her coming? The truth was simpler. No one had looked. Doyle, watching it unfold, tried again. A YouTube video, poorly lit, uploaded from what looked like his kitchen. He wore a t-shirt, eyes hollow, face puffy, with the kind of panic that tries to smile and fails. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice shaky. "I couldn't have known. I wasn't told. She didn't identify herself. I didn't see credentials. If I had known who she was, I would have handled it differently." But even in that, the problem persisted. It wasn't about who she was. It was about who he thought she wasn't. And Adrienne, by saying nothing, had made the nation ask the better question. By evening, art students were sketching her face in charcoal. Poets rewrote her words into stanzas. A jazz musician in New Orleans sampled her line into a rhythm track. A military wife stitched them into a quilt and posted the image online. "Check my military rank first, please," embroidered in silver thread. Her silence wasn't absence. It was architecture. Doyle's words, by comparison, began to decay on contact. The more he spoke, the more he vanished. Reporters no longer invited him for rebuttals. They didn't need to. The story had chosen its gravity, and he was not it. The final blow came when a major defense journal published an op-ed titled "The Myth of Knowing Power." It opened with a single paragraph. She said 6 words. He wrote entire paragraphs. Guess who history will remember? Underneath was a photo of Adrienne, not in uniform, not on a battlefield, not in court. Just her, mid-walk, exiting the courthouse. Shadow long, back straight, untouchable. And so 6 words rewrote the narrative. Not because they were loud, but because they didn't need to be. The nation hadn't yet exhaled from the 6 words that swept across headlines, timelines, and living rooms when the next wave hit, this time not from Adrienne Lane, but from the system that forged her. It began with a press release, not theatrical, not dripping in PR spin, but official, deliberate, and cold as a blade unsheathed before judgment. The Department of Defense issued a formal statement from its Office of Public Affairs. The seal was centered, the font stern, and the opening sentence struck like a bullet. The public humiliation of a ranking U.S. Army general is not a civilian oversight issue. It is a violation of military respect code and an insult to the structural sanctity of the chain of command. It continued without flourish. No speculation, no finger-pointing, just a crystalline reaffirmation. Major General Adrienne J. Lane is an active second officer, under strategic classification. Any attempt to discredit or unlawfully detain her represents not only a breach of intergovernmental protocol, but an erosion of national order. Then came the line that silenced even the noisiest newsrooms. To attack a general is to offend the discipline of the nation itself. The statement was shared in full by every major outlet, read aloud on the evening news like a declaration. But it wasn't just the military's voice that thundered. It was how it was spoken, final, immovable, unafraid. By the time Doyle read the release, the walls were already closing in. He had been summoned, not invited, to a closed-door meeting on the third floor of the precinct. No media, no windows, just a room that smelled like cold coffee and tighter consequences. His superior sat at the head of the table, the folder already open, pages splayed like evidence at a crime scene. The moment Doyle stepped inside, the captain didn't speak. He stared. When he finally did speak, it wasn't loud, but it was nuclear. "Do you even begin to understand who you laid hands on?" the captain snapped. Each word hammered with suppressed fury. "That woman isn't just some vet with a patch. She's Black Ops certified. She's led operations under presidential clearance. And you paraded her through our system like she was a shoplifter." Doyle opened his mouth. The folder slammed shut. Don't talk," the captain hissed. "You are not under review. You are under containment. You've put us, this department, this city, this chain of command on the radar of the Pentagon. You turned your ego into a national security infraction." There were no options on the table, no leniency. Only fallout. Doyle swallowed hard, but inside something twisted, not with guilt, but with bitterness. He'd always believed the badge made him untouchable. Now he realized it had simply made him visible, a target, not a titan. Meanwhile, Adrienne Lane moved in silence. But her silence now carried the weight of institutions. No interviews, no press appearance, just one action. A formal communication filed through her military counsel to the Department of Justice requesting an invocation of Article 35 under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, her right to remain publicly silent as a classified officer, citing strategic communication containment. It wasn't just her refusal to speak. It was her right not to. And suddenly, the silence became terrifying, because silence backed by force wasn't absent. It was an escalation. Within hours, a scanned document leaked, blurred, partially redacted, but unmistakably marked as internal correspondence between the Pentagon and Metro Police Department. It bore the watermark of the Office of Military Oversight. The subject line, "Request for personnel presence," closed testimony invitation read, "Violation of active duty officer protocol." The recipient, Chief Inspector Robert Treen, Metro PD. Doyle's chain of command. The leak hit Twitter like an avalanche. It wasn't an official summons. Yet. It was worse. It was a warning. The kind of warning empires give before they shift their boots toward accountability. Nobody commented. No one needed to. The headlines sharpened. NBC, Pentagon Eyes Police Department, after General's detainment. The Atlantic. The day a civilian officer thought he outranked war. From our website, at Leadership Next Pod, not just one man, what the Doyle incident reveals about civilian power fantasies. And then came the most damning question of all, posed by an op-ed in the Washington Post, now shared by generals, governors, and grassroots organizers alike. What system convinces a man with a badge that he is above a woman with medals? The question wasn't about Doyle anymore. It was about structure, culture, machinery. Doyle, now a man devoured by silence, tried again to post on social media. A new message. Shorter, more defensive. I did not know her status. I was operating on surface-level indicators, but the replies were savage. Maybe if you listened instead of performing, you'd have noticed her silence outranked your noise. You were loud, but you were never right. At headquarters, whispers spread. Officers no longer asked Doyle questions. They moved around him, avoided eye contact. The break room emptied when he walked in. Martinez, the rookie who once admired him, now looked at the floor. Respect wasn't lost. it was revoked. Outside, protest signs emerged, not against police in general, but against the illusion of unchecked enforcement. One in particular made the rounds on social media, a cardboard placard with Adrian's quote written in red marker, taped above Doyle's mugshot. "Check my military rank first, please." The image didn't scream, it pointed. Behind it all, Adrienne said nothing. She filed no personal suit, she issued no video. She didn't thank her supporters, she didn't attack her accuser. She simply stood still, and the system moved around her. Reporters camped outside military installations, hoping to catch her arriving for duty. None succeeded. She wasn't missing. She was protected by layers of clearance and respect few would ever understand. Her location wasn't secret, it was sacred. The Department of Defense released a second statement, shorter this time, more chilling. All personnel who engage with active military leadership are advised to adhere to intergovernmental protocol. Future infractions will be treated as breaches of federal discipline. No names were mentioned, but every officer in America knew who they meant. And somewhere, behind all that legal steel, Adrienne Lane sat at her desk, hands folded, eyes steady, reviewing a tactical report on troop morale under domestic pressure. Because while the world spun around her in silence, she had never stopped working. She wasn't the storm. She was the system's calm. The calm that follows when power, once mocked, finally opens its eyes. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in, slow and precise, like cold creeping into the joints of a house just before it crumbles. It didn't shout, it didn't confront, it just stopped answering. The first thing to vanish was the photo. It had hung in the central corridor of the precinct's east wing for nearly 3 years. Doyle, arms slung around a fellow officer, grinning like a man who believed his legend. The photo was taken after a narcotics raid, staged more for the press than the process. He was mid-laugh, sunglasses hanging from his collar, the caption below declaring him protector of the block. It had been framed, mounted, and spotlighted under a glass pane. But on a Thursday morning, without ceremony or announcement, it was gone. The wall was bare. No plaque, no nail, not even the outline where the frame had once hung. Just paint, untouched, uninterested. Doyle noticed immediately. He paused at the space like someone had erased part of his DNA. He looked around, expecting a joke, a reason, even a challenge, but none came. A couple of officers walked by, eyes focused on their coffee cups. No one made eye contact. No one acknowledged the space, or him. He checked his messages. A group chat that had once pinged with gallows humor and locker room swagger now showed blue dots beside his last 3 texts. Read, seen, ignored. He scrolled up. His last message had been a meme. The one before that, a comment about overreactions and media spin. No one had replied, not even a thumbs up. That was when he realized they weren't waiting for him to fall. He had already fallen. They were just choosing not to look down. Back in his office, his phone buzzed. A private number. The message was short, just a photo attachment. He opened it. Adrienne Lane stood at the front of a briefing room. Civilian setting, military gravity. She wore a dark blazer, no rank visible, but the posture unmistakable. She was pointing to a projection screen, surrounded by young officers in training. No caption, no threat. But the file name read, "Your Fraud Leading Doctrine." His hands trembled. He dropped the phone on his desk like it had burned him. No sender was listed, but he knew someone from within had sent it, not to provoke, but to educate, to remind him of what he got wrong. He stared at the screen for several seconds, willing it to become something else, a mistake, a prank, but it stayed. By midweek, the shift patterns changed. The lunch schedules he had once shared were suddenly reshuffled. The desks next to his were left empty for restructuring, elevators filled, then emptied before the doors closed if he stepped in. Martinez, once eager to ride along, now asked for reassignment to desk duty, quietly, without fanfare. The walls had not turned on Doyle. They had simply pulled away, brick by brick, until he stood exposed in a building that no longer believed in his story. He tried to reclaim the narrative. He drafted a message, carefully worded, unlike his usual spitfire tone. It read, "Adrienne, if you're willing, I'd prefer to apologize directly. I was wrong to act without full information. I am sorry." He hesitated, reread it. It sounded fragile, weak, but he sent it anyway. No reply. He checked again an hour later. Still nothing. The message remained unread. Or perhaps it was read and simply unworthy of a response. Either way, the effect was the same. He stared at the screen as if it would eventually deliver a second chance, but silence returned, and it stayed. In the cafeteria, Doyle sat alone for the third straight day. The table by the corner window, once his territory, remained unoccupied except by him. He stirred his coffee too long. The spoon clinked with a rhythm that began to annoy even himself. When Officer Granger passed with his tray, Doyle looked up, hopeful. Granger paused, just enough to make the moment cruel, then chose another table. 10 minutes later, it was Martinez who delivered the clearest blow. He entered with a sandwich, scanned the room, locked eyes with Doyle, then walked to another table. Doyle couldn't help himself. "Really?" he asked, not loud but sharp enough to cut across the room. Martinez turned slowly, expression unreadable. "I don't eat with men who insult the uniform," he said, then took a bite of his sandwich and turned away. Doyle felt the room tilt, not physically, morally. The man who had once raised a toast to being the wall between chaos and civilians now sat ostracized by his brothers in arms. Not because of court, not because of charges, but because of ethics. Because deep inside the marrow of every badge, there was a line that couldn't be crossed, and he had stepped over it with a smirk. He left the tray untouched. That night, alone in his apartment, Doyle opened his laptop again. No new texts. No new calls. The only alert was a news link forwarded by an anonymous user. He clicked it. It was a grainy video from a logistics academy graduation. Adrienne stood at the podium, not in uniform, but her presence was unmistakable. She addressed the audience in a clipped, focused tone. "You don't wear the uniform to speak louder," she said. "You wear it to protect those who can't." No applause, just respect. Doyle shut the lid slowly, and this time the silence wasn't punishment. It was exile. Exile had its rhythm. For Doyle it came with lukewarm coffee, side glances, and doors that once opened without knocking, now staying closed. But what he hadn't yet grasped, what he would soon learn with irreversible clarity, was that silence wasn't his only enemy anymore. Now came the excavation. It began, like most reckonings, with a request. A formal document was submitted to Internal Affairs by a third-party military council representing Adrienne Lane. The language was legal, procedural, and nearly sterile, but its implications were nuclear. The subject line read, "Request for full disclosure of arrest records. Officer Nathan Doyle, 10-year span." The department stalled. The lawyers didn't. By the end of the week, a judge approved the request. 10 years of arrests, 10 years of stops, citations, handcuffs, and discretionary authority. All of it pulled into the light, and it didn't take long to find the rot. Case, File 8021R, dated July 14, 2017. Location, Southside Boulevard, 1043 AMM. Subject, African American female, late 30, S. Registered nurse. No outstanding warrants. No traffic violations. Incident summary. Non-compliant during verbal exchange, but video buried in a corrupted file folder, now restored, showed a different scene. Doyle had pulled her over without stating a cause. The woman, calm, asked, "What did I do?" Doyle responded by opening the door himself, dragging her out by the elbow and pushing her to the hood of her car. The audio from the dashcam was faint but clear. "All you people need to do is shut up and comply. You want fairness? Go file it somewhere else." The woman had filed a complaint. It went nowhere. That video, now restored, made its way to the press. But it wasn't alone. It remained secretive for an audio clip. No visuals, but verified by timestamp, captured Doyle in the locker room during a conversation with two younger officers. His voice is unmistakable. His words are unforgettable. They don't need justice. They just need to be reminded. They bow their heads and I do the rest. Simple chain of command. The media didn't spin it. They quoted it. They bow their heads, and I do the rest. It hit the airwaves like venom dripping into public veins. News anchors didn't shout. They paused before reading it, as if swallowing the sickness inside it. The backlash was immediate. Reporters dug deeper. Community advocates who had fought for years to reopen cases finally had oxygen. Names emerged, quiet, forgotten, buried under bureaucracy. Victims who had long ago accepted invisibility now realized they weren't alone, that their pain wasn't isolated. It was patterned. I thought I was unlucky, said a schoolteacher who had been wrongfully searched outside a grocery store in 2016. Turns out I was just early. I remember his eyes, said a father of two detained at gunpoint in front of his children. He wasn't angry. He was entertained. The pattern wasn't procedural. It was personal. What had once been protected by policy now stood naked before a court of public conscience. The pressure mounted inside the department. Internal Affairs began interviews that they should have started years ago. Doyle was summoned, not to explain, but to sit, to listen, to absorb. One by one, supervisors who had once praised his assertiveness now dissected it as a liability. And through all of this, Adrienne Lane made no statement, except one. She sent a single message, encrypted, clean, direct, to her legal team. "I'm not here to retaliate," she wrote. "I'm here to name what was always there." And then, in a final line, "I don't want revenge, I want restoration." That quote leaked, not by accident, and it spread like a doctrine, because it wasn't about rage. It was about truth. Truth, when wrapped in silence, becomes radioactive. It seeps into systems, corrodes illusions, and forces recalibration. And that's exactly what was happening. TNN ran a primetime segment titled 10 Years of a Pattern. Who watched Doyle and did nothing? The Department of Justice released a statement confirming a preliminary review of possible civil rights violations under color of law. And Adrienne, she remained still, because the work was doing itself now. Her silence had birthed a reckoning. Doyle, meanwhile, was confined not by bars, but by memory. Each headline chipped away at the wall he once built from ego. Each case reopened dragged his legacy through the broken glass he had scattered for others. He stopped checking his phone. He unplugged his TV, but the world no longer needed his attention. It had already moved on without him, and beneath the weight of a decade now laid bare, his silence no longer felt like control. It felt like a consequence. The courtroom was smaller than the one before, less marble, more utilitarian. The lights were softer, almost kind, but the weight inside it was heavier than stone. Everyone knew what this hearing was. It wasn't about guilt. That part had already been laid bare, dissected, and documented. This was something else. Something quieter. The legal system now asked a different question. Not did he do it, but what should be done with him now? Adrienne sat calmly at the witness table. Her hair was tied back with military precision, her suit dark and unadorned. She looked neither angry nor triumphant, just present, as if she were fulfilling an obligation that required no emotion, only clarity. The judge read through the charges: violations of civil rights, unlawful detainment, and a pattern of abuse of authority. Each word landed in the room like a dropped coin. Not loud, but undeniable. Then the judge turned to her. "General Lane," he said, measured, careful not to make her rank a spectacle, "you've been allowed to recommend sentencing due to the unique nature of your case. Do you wish to pursue criminal prosecution?" She looked up. Not at the judge, not at Doyle, but somewhere in the middle distance, like she was addressing something larger than either man. "No," she said. The word didn't tremble. It didn't stall. It was clean, unmistakable. Doyle, sitting 3 chairs away, froze. His jaw clenched. His hands, once calloused from control, now sat limp in his lap. His breath hitched, not from relief, but from confusion. He had expected fury, expected a speech, a storm, a final push to cage him. Instead, she had diffused the moment with a single syllable. The courtroom remained silent, not out of respect, but because nobody knew what to do with mercy that didn't ask to be thanked. The judge nodded slowly. "You understand that declining criminal charges does not negate the civil proceedings or departmental review?" "I understand," she replied, voice steady. "And you understand this decision may be interpreted publicly as leniency." Adrian turned her gaze to the bench. Her voice dropped just half a key, enough to make the next sentence feel less like a reply and more like a doctrine. "I don't need him in a cell," she said. "I need him in a mirror. I want him to live long enough to see what kind of system made him feel righteous while doing what he did. And I want him to understand that what broke wasn't his career, it was his reflection." There was no applause, no gasp, only stillness. She stood. She collected her folder. Empty, symbolic, and walked toward the exit. Her heels didn't echo. Her stride didn't pause. At the edge of the witness table, she stopped. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and placed a folded sheet of paper on the wood. She didn't look back. She didn't speak. She simply laid it there, weightless, final. The bailiff picked it up after she left. No envelope, no seal, just 6 words, handwritten in deliberate, print-clear strokes. "Not everyone silent is weak." The judge read it, then folded it, then tucked it into the case file. Not for evidence, but for memory. Doyle didn't stand. He didn't speak. He didn't know how. She had chosen not to bury him. She had chosen to leave him above ground in full view, where the shame would do the work prison never could. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Flashes lit the steps, but she didn't stop. She passed through the crowd like fog through headlights, untouched, unbothered, unimpressed. When someone shouted, "Why no prison?" she didn't turn. She didn't smile. But for one brief second she looked to the sky, as if searching for something beyond headlines. That evening, the networks spun their stories. But the tone had changed. CNN ran a segment titled, "The Woman Who Didn't Need Bars." NPR quietly said, "Power exercised without punishment." The New York Times headline simply read, "She walked out, he stayed seated." And among the op-eds and think pieces, one line returned again and again. A woman declined to imprison the man who humiliated her because she was already free, and he never was. The silence surrounding Adrienne wasn't just armor now. It was the atmosphere, and Doyle, once so fluent in control, now sat in the very space she had left him, in public, in full light, with no chains to rattle, because she knew what the law couldn't teach. Sometimes the most powerful sentence is no sentence at all. He wasn't in prison, he wasn't exiled, he wasn't silenced by force. And yet, by the time Monday arrived, Nathan Doyle no longer existed in the space where honor once pretended to house him. His name wasn't removed from the precinct roster, but it was avoided like a curse. His badge hadn't been revoked, but it sat untouched in a drawer he no longer opened. His office remained clean, intact, and untouched, because no one wanted to sit where reputation had withered so publicly. But outside, far beyond the walls of the building that once echoed with his voice, something else had begun. It started with the veterans. The National Coalition of Military Veterans issued a statement, brief, clear, and final. It condemned the act not as a misstep, but as a breach of sacred ground. No uniform, civil or military, grants the right to humiliate those who have served. We will withhold cooperation, partnership, and any ceremonial affiliation with departments that allow behavior aligned with that of Officer Doyle to go unpunished. The backlash didn't stop at rhetoric. Pins were removed. Parade invitations were rescinded. Folded flags, once sent from precincts with honor, were now returned to sender, unopened. Memorial ceremonies, once attended jointly by veterans and law enforcement, began issuing specific requirements. No attendance permitted by officers currently or previously under public ethics review. The code was unspoken but clear. This wasn't a protest, it was a disavowal, and it was nationwide. Somewhere in the city square, under a tarp still smelling of fresh vinyl, a temporary monument had been erected. Not grand, not towering, but deliberate. A slab of metal, steel gray, sat on a modest pedestal. Etched into it, above a set of unadorned military boots, were 12 words. No one in uniform has the right to disgrace another. Beneath it, candles appeared, then flags, then photographs, not of war, but of dignity. Not a single one featured Doyle. He watched it on the news, alone. The screen cast a flickering light across his empty kitchen. He hadn't left the apartment in days, not because he couldn't, but because the world outside had stopped making space for him. On Twitter, his name trended, but not for reasons he'd recognize. Fall of the badge, silent salute, the wrong kind of loud. Articles surfaced, think pieces multiplied, but the term that cemented his place in cultural decay came from a viral blog post written by a retired Marine. It took one man to make the whole force bow their heads. That man was Nathan Doyle. It stuck. The internet, with its appetite for poetic damnation, latched onto it. Comment sections filled with that line, sarcastic, searing, final. The man who made a badge blush. And still, Adrienne said nothing. She didn't appear on television. She didn't attend the ceremonies. But the image of her, exiting the courthouse, captured from behind, became iconic. In the shot, she is framed by sunlight, her silhouette extending across the pavement, casting a shadow longer than her body, as if even the light itself knew to follow her lead. That photo was printed, shared, painted. A mural appeared on the wall of a military academy 2 states away. Just her back, her walk, and the shadows stretched before cadets ingraining. She hadn't spoken in days, and yet the nation continued listening. Doyle, by contrast, tried to reclaim a version of himself through one final interview. A late-night podcast accepted him, unfiltered. He wore a baseball cap low over his eyes. His voice was smaller, defensive. At one point, the host asked, "Looking back, do you regret the way it all unfolded?" Doyle paused, cleared his throat. "I regret that I didn't know who she was." The host was quiet, then leaned in. "No, that's not what I asked." Doyle blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you regret what you did? Not just who you did it to." He didn't answer. That silence, clipped and awkward, became the pull quote from the episode. Dozens of journalists clipped it, captioned it, and dissected it, and in every frame, Doyle looked smaller, not legally condemned, but ethically erased. His collapse wasn't dramatic, it was atmospheric. Even in cities where the case had become background noise, his name lingered like the aftertaste of something once sweet, now sour. And Adrienne, she appeared nowhere, and everywhere. Her voice, spoken once, still echoed across newsrooms. "I want him to live long enough to understand the system that built him." In that sentence, she had passed judgment, but in her walk out of court, she had passed sentence, and the world had obeyed. In the final paragraph of a powerful Sunday editorial, a respected columnist wrote, "She never had to shout, because the guilty always shout. For her, no further comment followed, because none was needed." The silence Adrienne left behind was not the end. It was a crack in the marble of authority, spreading unseen until it reached the marble halls of Congress. Less than 2 weeks after the courtroom emptied and the press had gone quiet, a federal representative from Virginia, once a military lawyer, now a firebrand, slammed his fist against the table of the Oversight Committee and demanded an emergency hearing. The subject: systemic abuse of power in domestic policing, triggered by a single silent act that had caught fire across the nation. The hearing wasn't just about Doyle, it was about everyone like him, hidden in plain sight, unchallenged for years. The committee chamber was packed to suffocation. News crews set up outside like a war front. Inside, every seat was filled with men and women in suits, some stone-faced, others visibly sweating. Adrienne Lane entered the room not as a victim, nor as a hero. She entered as evidence. Her posture was steel. Her face was unreadable. No decorations, no rank on display. Only the calibrated calm of someone who had commanded death and chosen this time restraint. The room did not greet her with applause. It held its breath. "Ms. Lane," the chair began, deliberately avoiding the word general, as if titles could somehow contain her, "you are not obligated to speak today. But if you do, this committee will hear you fully." Adrienne leaned forward. Her voice, when it came, did not rise. It sliced. "I have no apology to offer. I did not come here to soothe guilt. I came to redefine power." And there was no rustling of papers, no whispers, just the sheer collapse of expectation. The phrase hit like a sniper shot. Precise, clean, final. She continued. "Power is not the badge, not the gun, not the law twisted to favor whoever holds the pen. Power is the ability to stand silent when accused, to endure humiliation without collapsing, and to walk back into the very room where you were doubted and not lower your eye." The questions that followed were bland, bureaucratic, almost cowardly, but Adrienne answered only what demanded weight. "I will not recount what happened," she said. "You saw it. The world saw it. The silence I offered was not submission, it was containment. I will not be your mirror for regret." Elsewhere, a video leaked. Doyle, sweaty, pale, shaking, was caught pacing in a sterile office. His hand trembled as he tried to light a cigarette, missing the flame twice. The press had asked him to appear before the committee. He declined, citing mental health degradation due to public backlash. It was the most articulate excuse he'd ever offered. But the footage said more than any statement. The eyes that once narrowed in suspicion now darted in panic. The man who once shouted into a body cam now whispered to no one. As the committee recessed, a confidential document hit the press like a body thrown from a rooftop. 8 years. Dozens of arrests, not one re-evaluated. Every single case involving a person of color under Doyle's patrol had been processed, filed, and forgotten. No reviews, no inquiries, just silent stamps in a system greased by familiarity and protected by plausible deniability. The phrase pattern of impunity was no longer theoretical. It had a face and a badge. The New York Times ran the story in a full-spread Sunday issue. The headline was both brutal and surgical, from a jacket to a national reckoning. Underneath, 2 photos. Adrienne standing with her back straight before the committee, and Doyle, hunched under fluorescent lights, eyes haunted, as if finally beginning to see what others had lived for decades. The contrast was not symbolic. It was anatomical. Back inside the chamber, Adrienne gave her final statement. She didn't look at the committee members when she spoke. She stared into the cameras, into living rooms, classrooms, and offices, into every place where silence was mistaken for absence. "I did not seek to expose a man," she said. "I showed you a system. He was merely obedient." A pause, long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough to sink. Then she stood. No further comments, no backward glance. Her chair remained empty. But the echo she left behind would be louder than any testimony. That night, cable news called her the quiet architect of a moral tribunal. Analysts dissected her every phrase, every pause, but they missed the most violent part. She had not condemned anyone. She had only defined them, and sometimes that's the cruelest sentence. Doyle did not return calls. He did not post. His silence now was not a weapon, it was a sentence. But unlike Adrienne's silence, strategic, commanding, his was the collapse of a man who had once confused noise for authority. The nation was watching now, but no one was listening to his voice anymore. There was a new standard being etched into the stone of justice. It didn't wear medals, it didn't shout, it walked in without flinching, and it left behind only the truth, sharp as a bayonet pressed against the throat of lies. The echo of Adrienne's words before Congress had barely begun to settle when Doyle resurfaced, digitally, predictably, and without conviction. He appeared in a low-resolution video, framed awkwardly in front of a beige wall. His uniform jacket zipped to the collar as if the fabric might hold together the pieces of a reputation already shattered. His voice was flat, rehearsed, thick with the desperation of a man not seeking forgiveness but survival. "I didn't know she was a general," he said. staring somewhere just below the lens. No acknowledgement of misconduct, no ownership, just that single hollow line repeated twice, like a failing mantra. He blinked too much. His lips twitched at the corners, not from remorse, but from restraint, as though a truer, uglier version of himself waited just beneath the surface, biting its tongue. The internet did not forgive him. It didn't even pause to consider. Within hours, the video was cut, remixed, and paired side by side with footage of Adrienne leading a unit under enemy fire, shouting commands through smoke and chaos. In one frame, her gaze was steel under a dust-smeared helmet. On the other hand, Doyle blinked into his front camera, like a schoolboy caught cheating and trying to blame the lighting. The contrast wasn't cruel, it was surgical. The world saw the difference between earned silence and performative noise. The message didn't need text overlays or commentary. The images spoke clearly. Character is not claimed, it is proven. Adrienne, when reached for comment, didn't sit for interviews or issue a press release. She released a single-line written response sent through her legal team. My title never required his recognition, only his respect. It landed like a blade across Doyle's last attempt at dignity. No need for flair, no need for amplification, just precision. The statement went viral within minutes, dissected by pundits and scholars alike for its perfect economy of truth. Here was a woman who had every right to rage and chose clarity. A warrior who let her stance, not her volume, cut through the air. In a press briefing held later that week, a reporter finally dared to ask the question lingering in the public mind, General Lane, if you hadn't been a general, if you had just been a civilian, what would you have done? Adrienne didn't hesitate. Her tone didn't soften. It didn't sharpen either. It remained unmoved, like a flag anchored in concrete. I might have stayed silent, she said. But he miscalculated the silence. He bet against the wrong person. It wasn't pride that echoed in her voice. It was weight. The weight of history, of buried names and unseen battles, of voices ignored until the silence erupted into consequence. Doyle watched that clip alone. Again and again. Paused. Rewound. Watched it from different devices as if the screen mattered. But nothing changed. Her calm struck harder than any condemnation. Her composure dragged his posture into memory, back to the moment he first tightened the cuffs, back when he believed she was nobody, back when his voice filled rooms and his badge felt infinite. Now all he had was a video apology that nobody believed, and a silence from her that everyone trusted. Veterans groups were not kind. They issued joint statements that sliced deeper than headlines. An apology delivered too late cannot polish a tarnished badge. Silence, when earned, inspires, but cowardice dressed as regret merely insults. These were not slogans, they were verdicts. And they didn't mention his name, because they didn't need to. The shadow of his mistake was large enough to identify him without being spoken. Former soldiers, men and women who had worn uniforms with less rank but more honor, came forward with fury in their eyes and fire in their veins. They didn't want retribution, they wanted correction, and they wanted it to be public. Doyle tried to stay relevant, planting stories through anonymous sources, hinting at stress, at breakdown, at political agendas. But none of it stuck. The world had seen enough. His narrative had collapsed under the weight of his refusal to admit the truth. It wasn't that he didn't know Adrienne was a general. It was that he didn't think anyone like her could ever hold authority he had to answer to. His error wasn't factual. It was ideological. Adrienne never responded again. Not to questions, not to headlines, not to provocations. Her refusal to engage was not passive. It was punishing. Each silence she offered was a mirror, forcing Doyle to see his voice echoing into a void he had created. And in that void, he shrank. Once, he had towered over people with the confidence of someone never corrected. Now, he was a headline without a quote, a face on screen without context, a man speaking apologies into an audience that had already moved on. What remained was a legacy, and it did not favor him. In classrooms, students replayed her words, not his. In training modules, her posture, not his uniform, was used to teach restraint, presence, and dignity. His voice, once amplified by the authority of his position, was now muted by the irrelevance of his integrity. And when asked what his greatest mistake was, Doyle, if he ever dared answer, would have to choose between two truths: believing she was no one, or realizing too late that she had never needed to be known to be right. This was not a fall. It was erosion, gradual, unrelenting, irreversible, not caused by a storm, but by exposure. And Adrienne didn't push him. She didn't point. She simply stood, higher, clearer, until the system itself tilted in her direction and let gravity finish the work. The silence that once cloaked Adrienne like armor had now become a force of nature, reshaping institutions, toppling assumptions, and bending conversations without needing her voice. She was nowhere to be seen, and yet her presence anchored every word, every breath, every trembling admission. Her name alone summoned attention not as a scandal, but as standard. When a major television network announced a live panel discussion on accountability, power, and public trust, they never had to say it outright. Everyone knew Adrienne Lane would be at the heart of it, whether she attended or not. The studio lights burned hot. The moderator, a veteran anchor with a reputation for surgical questioning, sat between a retired police chief, a constitutional lawyer, and a decorated colonel. On the screen behind them, one still image lingered. Adrienne in uniform, her eyes forward, expression unreadable, as though even the camera understood it was not her soul to capture. The conversation began civilly, with legal terms and procedural breakdowns, but it didn't take long for the fault lines to show. The law was followed, the ex-cop said, voice tight, as though choking on his defense. There was no way he could have known. The lawyer interrupted, cold and exact. Ignorance of rank is not ignorance of dignity. What he saw wasn't the absence of status. It was the presence of control, and that scared him. Control? The officer scoffed. She didn't say a word. Exactly, the colonel cut in. And that's what buried him. The line hit the panel like a hammer to glass, sending a ripple through the studio. It was the beginning of a shift, not in volume, in weight. Then came the moment that rewrote the room. A caller patched in live. The screen split. A man's face, creased with years, worn with memory, appeared. "My name is Ronald Casey," he said, "and I'm here because silence deserves witnesses. Back in 2014, I was driving home when Doyle pulled me over. I asked why. He didn't answer, just yanked me out and shoved my face into the pavement. I still have the photo. Still got the scar." He held it up to the camera. Grainy, dark, but undeniable. No one spoke. No rebuttal, no denial. Just a second of life, national stillness that screamed louder than headlines. The host tried to pivot. "Do you believe what happened to General Lane reflects a pattern?" Ronald's reply was measured, slow, not for dramatic effect, but because pain rarely races. "I think she's the first one who had enough rank for the world to notice." And with that, the conversation was no longer about protocol. It was about recognition. It was about the millions of faces unseen because they didn't come draped in medals. Adrienne's story had not replaced theirs. It had exposed them. Her silence had carried their voices forward. In a small apartment a few miles away, Doyle sat alone, the television cast shifting light across his face, hollowing the edges. He held a glass of bourbon in one hand, but it remained untouched. His fingers trembled slightly, not from cold, but from clarity. Every word spoken on the screen seemed aimed at him, not shouted, not spit, but presented with such calm finality that he couldn't look away. He watched as the colonel spoke again. "You don't recover from this with apologies. You recover by becoming obsolete. That man," he didn't say Doyle's name, "was the product of a system that never expected consequences. He's facing one now, and it's wearing a woman's silence like a blade." In the background of Doyle's apartment, the remnants of who he once pretended to be were crumbling. A photo of him shaking hands with his old unit captain had been turned face down on the counter, the frame dusty, ignored. The room was filled with shadows, and none of them offered comfort. He leaned forward, the glass tilting but still full. He wasn't drinking. he was sinking. A professor of sociology was brought in near the end of the broadcast. He didn't speak with urgency. His voice was measured, clinical, and even, but his analysis struck with surgical coldness. "We are witnessing the ascension of a new power structure," he explained, "one not based on titles or institutions, but on resonance." Adrienne Lane didn't need to protest, to scream, to retaliate. Her refusal to engage has destabilized every room her name enters. We are watching the rise of silence as insurgency, and it is profoundly effective. The moderator asked him to elaborate. The sociologist didn't hesitate. "This is not justice by volume. This is not vengeance by spectacle. It's something deeper. When silence aligns with moral clarity, it becomes a verdict. The public no longer demands her presence. They model their conscience after her absence." As the program concluded, viewers were left not with answers, but with aftershocks. The host didn't sign off with a slogan or summary. He looked into the camera and simply said, "You've seen enough." And the country had, not because Adrienne spoke, but because she didn't need to. She had become the gravity pulling hypocrisy out of orbit. The judgment wasn't a ruling. It wasn't a sentence. It was the collective decision of a society realizing that dignity doesn't beg for notice. It stands so tall it cannot be ignored. Doyle turned off the television. The screen went black, but the noise in his mind didn't fade. It buzzed. It mocked. It repeated the caller's voice. "I still have the photo." And suddenly Doyle realized what had truly broken him. It wasn't Adrienne's silence. It was that she never looked back. She never needed to. And he would spend the rest of his life trying to be remembered by a world that had finally decided he wasn't worth the echo. The television screen faded to black, but the weight of judgment did not leave Doyle's chest. It followed him, clung to his breath, lined the edge of every waking moment with the sharpness of things unsaid. There was no longer any performance to sustain, no stage left to command, only silence, and the unbearable question of what remained after noise had lost its power. He didn't plan his steps, he just arrived, drawn by instinct or maybe desperation. Outside the courthouse where Adrienne Lane was scheduled to appear, not as defendant, not as prosecutor, but as an honored witness to a case involving military discrimination, he stood like a man summoned to his reckoning. He wore civilian clothes, though they hung off him like a borrowed past. His shoes were scuffed, his jacket is thin. In his hand he gripped nothing, no phone, no paper, not even his dignity, just the tremor of someone who had run out of exits. He stood behind the barricades, just far enough not to be noticed by the press, but close enough to see her when she emerged. The sun was cold, the pavement is unforgiving. Every second stretched like a blade about to fall. Then she appeared. Adrienne didn't stride. She didn't march. She simply walked, measured and grounded, as if the earth itself realigned beneath each step. No guards flanked her, no entourage, no entourage. She didn't need symbols. She was one. Her eyes didn't search the crowd. She didn't acknowledge the cameras. But as she neared the exit, her gaze shifted, almost imperceptibly, and found him. Doyle felt it before she even looked directly at him, a quiet tightening in the chest, like being seen naked in a room full of mirrors. He lowered his eyes. The instinct was primal, involuntary. Shame doesn't announce itself. It inhabits. She paused. 3 seconds, long enough to change the air, long enough for the gravity of her stillness to draw every molecule in that space toward one center. Her voice, when it came, did not rise. It did not accuse. It simply existed. "I don't forbid your apology," she said, the words as clean and sharp as polished steel. "I just won't accept it." He flinched as if slapped, though her tone carried no venom, only truth, the kind that strips, not wounds, the kind that leaves nothing to hide behind. His mouth opened before his mind caught up. I have nothing left," he said. His voice cracked, not from emotion, but from erosion. The erosion of arrogance, of certainty, of a lifetime spent yelling into silence that now answered back without raising its voice. Her reply was softer, but no less final. "I know," she said, "because you threw it all away. With your voice. No fury, no flourish, just a single line of perfect symmetry. Then she walked past him, the air parting but not pausing, the world turning as if her movement calibrated its spin. She didn't look back. Of course, she didn't. Those who carry truth forward do not need to revisit ruin. Behind her, Doyle stood frozen. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He didn't chase. Because there was nothing left to reach for. Not redemption, not relief, just the echo of a moment in which he had finally heard himself through someone else's silence. And what he heard was unbearable. Inside the building, the hearing continued without disturbance. Adrienne gave her testimony calmly, precisely, like someone more fluent in battle than in bitterness. Her role wasn't to condemn, it was to bear witness, and she did, without trembling, without elaboration, without performance. Every word she spoke was calibrated not for show, but for record, not for vengeance, but for truth. Outside, Doyle still lingered. People passed him. No one recognized him, or worse. Some did and kept walking. A man once feared, now faded into the background noise. He hadn't fallen. He was discarded, not because Adrian demanded it, but because he'd carved his path there, one syllable at a time. That night, no headlines mentioned the encounter. No cameras captured it. No microphones caught the exchange. But in the quiet corners of memory, where real judgments are made, that moment had been written in stone, not shouted, etched. The final encounter had happened, not in court, not in the media, in the space between two people, where power is not proven by dominance, but by who can walk away standing taller. And Adrian Lane once again walked without weight, because the truth had always been heavier on the other man's shoulders. When Adrienne walked past Doyle without flinching, she wasn't just leaving him behind, she was walking toward something larger. In the stillness of that moment, where judgment had spoken without raising its voice, a different kind of call echoed back, not from the press, not from the courts, but from the highest echelon of uniformed command. The official envelope bore the seal of the Department of Defense. Inside was not praise, not an apology, a summons, a formal invitation from the Pentagon itself, requesting Adrienne Lane deliver the keynote address at the graduation ceremony of the next officer training class. The message was unmistakable. They weren't just honoring her presence, they were asking her to reset the compass. She didn't delay. That same night she sat alone in her study, the desk uncluttered, the light deliberate, and began to write. No drafts, no scribbles, just one stream of thought, forged in clarity. The speech, when finished, fit perfectly on a single sheet of military stationery. The opening line would become doctrine before the ceremony even began. Don't assume a silent eye cannot see wrongdoing. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a strategy, a reminder that silence is not a void, it's a vantage point. The day of the event arrived with solemn precision. Rows of cadets stood in polished formation under the vaulted ceiling of the auditorium. Brass shined, boots aligned, traditions intact. But when Adrienne took the stage, the air shifted. She didn't command the room. She calibrated it. No need to adjust the mic. Her voice didn't rise. It expanded. She didn't speak of herself. She spoke of oath, of burden, of the kind of power that doesn't demand allegiance but earns it. We have placed too much faith in symbols, she said. Uniforms, medals, and insignias. None of these ensure justice. You are not defenders of appearance. You are architects of conduct. Ask yourselves not what you wear, but what you protect. The room did not move, not even to breathe. Meanwhile, far from the ceremony, inside the same precinct where Doyle had once ruled with unchecked swagger, a young officer quietly submitted a formal transfer request. No press release, no protest, just a handwritten note attached to his personnel file. I no longer wish to serve in the shadow of Doyle. His supervisors didn't challenge it. They understood. There were no more illusions left to defend. In response to the rising tide of scrutiny, the Department of Justice announced a federal task force to audit police units across the country with histories of racial profiling and internal protectionism. What had begun as one man's abuse of power had evolved into a multi-agency excavation of structural rot. Files were unsealed, patterns were tracked. Silence had lit the fuse. The system would now do the detonating. Back at the Pentagon, Adrienne concluded her address without flourish. "We must ask the question anew," she said, gaze leveled, tone unshaken. Who carries the law on their chest, and who carries justice in their heart? It wasn't rhetorical. It was a charge, a demand to redefine allegiance, not to uniform, but to purpose. When offered a Medal of Distinction after the speech, she declined. No interviews, no photo ops. Her request was simple and final. Spend the cost of that medal on auditing misconduct. That's my honor. And with that, she stepped off the stage, leaving behind applause that sounded more like agreement than admiration. Her speech traveled faster than planned. Within hours, officer academies across 3 states requested transcripts. It was quoted in internal memos, slipped into training modules, etched on whiteboards in break rooms, not as inspiration, as an instruction, a recalibration. No longer could any official claim ignorance when the new standard had been spoken without rage, without compromise, without noise. In boardrooms and back halls, policymakers began asking each other harder questions. Who defines decorum? Who polices the enforcers? And perhaps most dangerously, what happens when the most powerful voice refuses to shout yet still commands a nation's attention? Adrienne never raised her tone. She never raised her hand. But the system did. It raised flags. It raised audits. It raised accountability. Because a woman had once stood alone, handcuffed, silent, and turned that silence into policy. And the Pentagon, not with ceremony but with course correction, had finally answered, not with praise but with permission to change. The applause faded, the podium cleared, and Adrienne stepped back into shadow, not out of retreat but to strike where volume no longer sufficed. After the Pentagon's echo, she moved quietly, surgically, with the precision of someone trained not to declare victory, but to dismantle false absolution. Weeks passed. Then one crisp morning, a civil suit bearing her name landed on the docket of a federal court. Adrienne Lane v. Officer Nathan Doyle. The charges were direct, unembellished, and lethal in clarity. Defamation, unlawful arrest, public misconduct, and intentional infliction of reputational harm. No preamble, no spectacle. Just truth framed in legal weight. News broke within minutes, and Doyle's camp scrambled. His legal team reached out with offers for a private settlement. Negotiations behind closed doors, confidential terms, a statement ghost-written for him, wrapped in pseudo-regret. But Adrienne refused. Her reply was a single line submitted through her counsel. "I do not sell back my self-respect." There was no press conference, no social media blast, just silence, sharpened to a scalpel. And in that silence, the lawsuit gained traction, not as an act of vengeance, but of restoration. The courtroom was smaller than the one before, but the stakes were larger. This was not about criminality. This was about character. And Doyle, sitting at the defense table, looked nothing like the man who once barked into radios and pressed cold cuffs into warm wrists. His posture had shrunk, his suit didn't fit, his hands fidgeted as if trying to erase fingerprints from history. Adrienne entered without announcement. She wore no uniform, no insignia, just a navy suit and the stillness of someone who understood the weight of precision. She didn't scan the room, she didn't nod at the judge, she simply sat. And when her name was called, she stood with such calm that the courtroom seemed to realign around her. The trial lasted one day, not because it lacked evidence, but because the evidence was irrefutable. Security footage, eyewitness testimony, public records, and Doyle's broadcasts, which had once served him as propaganda, now played as confession. The judge, an aging jurist known for reserved demeanor, spoke with measured gravity at the verdict. This case is not about embarrassment. It is about the abuse of symbolic power. When one acts as the law rather than under it, the injury is not only personal, it is constitutional. The sentence was precise: $650,000, 0 cents in damages, plus permanent disqualification from holding any position within public service, federal, state, or municipal. No appeal allowed, no mitigation. Doyle didn't react. He blinked once, then stared forward, as if understanding had finally taken shape, not as a moment, but as a consequence crystallized in form. The room emptied. He stayed seated. He had nowhere else to stand. Adrienne did not collect the payment. She didn't touch the check. Instead, her legal team released a public document outlining the full donation of the awarded amount to a trust fund for the legal protection and honor defense of female veterans, especially those subjected to misconduct while out of uniform. She added no personal statement, no quote, only the title of the fund, Silent Honor. The name said enough. The press swarmed, eager for a soundbite, a gesture, a glimpse. Adrienne gave none. Her silence by now had become both language and verdict. She had not taken Doyle's money. She had turned it into a mirror. And in that mirror, the system could no longer pretend it didn't see itself. For Doyle, the consequences didn't stop with the gavel. His disqualification made the National Registry. His employment history flagged. Job offers evaporated before reaching the inbox. Applications unanswered. The silence that had once crushed others now circled him. Airtight. He had lost more than a case. He had lost his ability to pretend he still belonged anywhere power was spoken. And for Adrienne, nothing changed, because she had never sought change for herself. Her victory wasn't the verdict. It was the incision. Clean, unflinching. A cut so precise it left no blood, but made the whole body tremble. That was the weight of justice when wielded not for show, but for definition. The system didn't cheer, it adjusted. And in that subtle shift, in that recalibrated silence, a different kind of authority took root, one not built on reaction, but on restraint. And Adrienne Lane, as always, walked away, not taller, but unchanged, because she had never needed the world to recognize her strength, only to reckon with its own. Justice, when cleanly delivered, doesn't fade. It replicates. In the weeks following the civil verdict, institutions no longer whispered, they acted. At the state's premier police academy, the curriculum board convened an emergency review. No cameras, no press, just senior instructors looking down at a set of printed transcripts, a 47-second video clip, and a list of recommendations titled, not with legalese, but with candor. Failure teaches nothing if the system refuses to learn. That meeting resulted in a reform that would become model legislation, the complete overhaul of the public conduct and ethics course. Adrienne's courtroom footage, once a moment, now became a method. Her quiet, restrained posture during the unlawful arrest was dissected frame by frame. Her courtroom silence, her congressional composure, her refusal to lash back when baited. They were broken down like combat drills, and at the top of the new module, projected onto screens in lecture halls across the country, sat the headline of her case, a smile that brought down a system. It wasn't a metaphor. It was structure, undone by presence. Meanwhile, Doyle had vanished from every official document, but not from public consciousness. His name lived on, not in record, but in resistance. In a dim second-floor apartment rented weekly, by cash, he now moved like someone dodging ghosts. He no longer looked over his shoulder for a physical threat. What followed him was worse recognition. Every grocery store glance, every turned face on the street, every whispered moment of silence when he entered a space, was a verdict all its own. He had become a cautionary tale no one needed to name. In a final attempt at recovery, he applied for a security position at a local industrial complex. Entry level, low clearance, uniform provided. He received the rejection in 2 sentences. We regret to inform you that your profile does not meet the ethical suitability requirements of this sector. The paper was unsigned. It didn't need a name. The system had learned, finally, to police itself. Adrienne, true to form, never acknowledged his dissent. Her work continued, not in courts or interviews, but in quiet halls where change began from within. At a leadership training seminar for law enforcement instructors, she took the stage not with grandeur, but with surgical purpose. Her words were clipped, her tone even, her gaze unrelenting. Justice, she said, is not only about sentencing. It's about signaling. You train not to punish the bad. You train to stop others from thinking they can become him. There was no need to say who he was. The room understood. But Adrienne delivered wasn't inspiration. It was structured. Language stripped of performance. Doctrine without applause. The audience didn't cheer, they took notes. In the months that followed, more agencies adopted the revised materials. Ethics training no longer begins with hypotheticals. It began with real footage, real consequences, real silence. Adrienne's image, once used without her consent to shame her, was now licensed with her approval as an instrument of warning. Her likeness didn't sell merchandise. It reset the policy. Doyle, in contrast, disappeared from language entirely. His name was replaced with classifications, breach of conduct, misuse of authority, and legacy disqualification. He became a data point, a red flag in hiring systems, not erased, archived, coded into the very background check that had once failed to stop him. Now he was the firewall, and Adrienne never raised her voice because she didn't need to. Every reform bore her echo. Every policy pivot carried the aftershock of her restraint. She had never sought to punish him personally. What she delivered instead was institutional immunity, reversed, corrected, and made visible. This wasn't revenge, it was an instruction, the kind that doesn't end when the speaker leaves the stage, the kind that lives in silence until someone breaks it the wrong way and finds the system is finally listening. In the aftermath of structural revisions and institutional reckoning, Adrienne became less visible, yet more present than ever. Her silence no longer operated in defiance. It had matured into a legacy. The system, reshaped by her restraint, began reflecting not just on what had occurred, but on what it had almost missed. One afternoon, as leaves drifted through the wind like pages left unbound, a documentary filmmaker knocked on Adrienne's door with a binder full of permissions, a production team waiting, and a question burning in his throat. He didn't pitch fame. He didn't offer dramatization. He simply asked, "Can we tell your story?" Adrienne studied him for a full minute before answering. "That story," she said with surgical precision, "doesn't belong to me. It belongs to how people choose silence, or don't." Then she stepped back, closed the door gently, and left the idea with him, not declined, not endorsed, just returned to the world to earn its purpose. Still, the film moved forward. It was not propaganda, nor was it revisionist. It was curated restraint, segments of testimony, courtroom footage, a slow montage of shifting policies, and the infamous line delivered without flair, but with eternal punctuation. "I don't accept your apology." During the first screening, the room was heavy with breath. No narration, no orchestral swelling, just silence that built itself into the structure. And then the scene played, the refusal, the line that had fractured a culture of impunity. When it faded to black, the audience stood, not out of politeness, out of instinct, as if staying seated would have been a betrayal of what they'd just witnessed. Somewhere, miles away from the packed theater in a cheap motel with peeling wallpaper and a flickering ceiling light, Doyle watched the same documentary on a rented television. He sat on the edge of a sunken mattress, eyes locked, unmoving. The volume was low, almost inaudible, but the images needed no sound. His hands trembled, not with rage, not with denial, but with clarity too long deferred. When the camera returned to Adrienne's still face, when the voice repeated her refusal to accept contrition, something in him cracked. Not loudly, but all the more destructively. His eyes filled, his vision blurred. The screen faded behind a wall of tears that came not from grief, but from the collapse of illusion. This was no longer the system turning its back. It was him, finally seeing his own. In another corner of the country, the ripple extended further than headlines or political chambers. A teenage girl, sitting in her bedroom, surrounded by textbooks and a worn school blazer, typed a letter by hand. The handwriting was neat. Every sentence is measured. It wasn't long. Just true. "Dear Ms. Lane," it began, "I wear a uniform to school, and I used to hate it. I thought it made me a target, but after seeing what you did by not yelling, by just standing still, I'm not afraid anymore. Thank you for making silence something powerful." Adrienne received it weeks later. No return address, no name, just initials. She read it once, then folded the paper with deliberate care, placed it in a drawer filled not with awards, but with moments. No speech followed, no post, no fanfare, just a soft smile, quiet, unforced, the kind of smile that recognizes change when it no longer needs to prove itself. The story, after all, was never about her. It was about the system that tested her and failed itself, about the people who mistook stillness for absence, about a society that finally looked inward and saw, for the first time, not a hero, but a mirror. And some mirrors, once cracked, showed the truth more clearly than ever before. There would be no sequel, no concluding roar, only the continued resonance of one choice made again and again, to stand still, to say less, and to let everything that needed to fall, fall. And in that falling, something finally stood up. The letter from the student remained untouched in the drawer, an envelope yellowing softly beneath the weight of everything unsaid. Adrienne never reread it. She didn't need to. The words, once folded into her fingers, had taken root in her posture. It wasn't the first message she'd received, but it was the first one she chose to keep, not because it praised her, but because it reminded her that courage was contagious when passed quietly. The girl hadn't thanked her for saving her, she had thanked her for not being afraid. That distinction mattered. Outside, the world had grown louder again. News cycles moved on. Politicians rushed to package progress into slogans. Institutions took victory laps for reforms they'd once resisted. But Adrienne didn't walk in those parades. She walked her silence, not as a protest, but as discipline. She wasn't avoiding the spotlight. She simply knew the difference between being watched and being heard. And so when the National Committee for Military Honor extended the invitation, an address at the annual Valor Assembly, attended by over 2,000 uniformed officers, live broadcast across the country, she didn't say yes out of obligation. She said yes because the silence had to end somewhere, not shattered, not discarded, delivered. The auditorium was carved into the side of a hill, its ceiling arched like the barrel of a cannon. Inside, columns stood like sentries, and the air carried the weight of oaths recited in every war since ink touched parchment. Rows upon rows of polished uniforms filled the seats, captains with creased brows, cadets with trembling hands, veterans who had stopped clapping at speeches decades ago. They didn't come to hear heroism. They came to witness conclusion. Adrienne stood backstage, not rehearsing. She didn't need to. The speech had lived inside her long before the invitation ever arrived. She hadn't written it for them. She hadn't written it for Doyle. She hadn't even written it for herself. It was a truth meant to outlive the telling, a string of words that would cut clean without bleeding. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage with no medals on her chest, no ranks on her collar, no paper in her hands, just a black suit, tailored to simplicity, and a presence that made the room forget to shift in their chairs. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't glance at the cameras. She didn't begin with acknowledgments. Instead, she began with air. "I am not here to recount," she said, her voice low but ringing, the kind of tone that makes a room stop breathing. "I am not here to be applauded. I am not even here for forgiveness." She paused. "Not for effect, but for truth to settle. I am here to name something we've refused to name for too long." The pause that followed was not discomfort. It was confirmation. Her voice continued, smooth but firm, like metal heated to pliability, but not weakness. "There was a time, not long ago," she said, "when standing upright was an act of defiance. Not because we were rebels, but because silence was mistaken for weakness. And we let that mistake fester. No movement in the crowd, no cough, just listening, sharpened into stillness. This isn't about me," she said. This is about every face that was overlooked because it didn't demand attention, every uniform that was questioned, every salute was returned with suspicion. She let her gaze rest on no one and everyone at once. Some of you know these people, some of you are these people, and some left before they could ever be acknowledged. She didn't say Doyle's name. She didn't have to. The absence was an indictment. We built a system that taught us how to follow orders, she said, but we failed to teach how to recognize dignity. That isn't a procedural flaw, that's a moral one. She stopped, hands still by her side, her eyes unflinching. I've heard people say I was brave. I wasn't. I was tired, and when the system tried to silence me, I didn't scream. I just didn't move, and that somehow broke it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. Something unspoken, finally acknowledged without needing to be defined. And Adrian, motionless at the podium, simply waited for nothing. She stood still. The words had landed. Not like applause lines in a campaign rally. Not like fire in a courtroom. These words didn't rise. They settled. Deep, exact. Like sediment building into a new foundation. Adrienne didn't fill the silence with pacing. She filled it by letting it echo. When she stepped back from the podium just half a pace, the breath of the audience didn't return. It stayed, suspended. A discipline of listening. A silence that was no longer hesitant, but reverent. In the front row, an older colonel sat unmoving, his hand clenched not in anger but in anchoring. A cadet 3 rows back blinked rapidly, not out of boredom but to resist the surge pressing behind his eyes. An officer near the edge of the row, decorated in campaign ribbons across his chest, shifted his thumb over the fabric of his collar as if confirming it still belonged there. Adrian saw them, not their faces individually, but the shift, the quiet contracting of the room's breath. It wasn't dramatic. It was seismic. Her presence didn't overwhelm them. It calibrated them. And for the first time in decades, valor had nothing to do with medals. It had everything to do with who dared to stand and not step forward. She continued, not louder but clearer. I was not asked to speak today because I fought, she said. Hundreds in this room have done that. I was asked to speak because I did not fight back. The distinction was sharp, not modesty, precision. And somehow, in this country, in this uniform, in this moment, restraint made the system flinch harder than rebellion ever could. Her hands remained still at her sides. Her voice never dipped nor soared. It simply moved, clean and irreversible, like truth that no longer waited for permission. We have celebrated silence when it wears the right title, she said, but we punish it when it stands in the wrong body, the wrong gender, the wrong face. I did not win a case. I exposed a habit. A murmur nearly rose, but it died before reaching the surface. No one dared interrupt, not with noise, not even with a reaction. You've seen footage, you've read headlines, you've watched the ripple, but what you haven't seen, Adrian said, is the generations who flinched before raising their hand, who swallowed orders that were never spoken but always expected. That's not discipline, that's design, and we have no excuse to pretend we didn't see it anymore. She let the silence return, but now it wasn't absence, it was a response. Behind her, the massive banner of the armed forces glinted under a soft light. It wasn't the centerpiece. Adrienne was. But she wasn't centered on herself. She had become, in that moment, an instrument, not of reckoning, but of resetting. She didn't accuse, she redirected. She didn't speak about their failures. She spoke about what they still had time to become. I'm not asking you to remember me, she said. I'm asking you to remember what it looked like when a single refusal to react forced a system to expose its foundation. She paused again. No breath caught in her throat. Her lungs were steady. Her voice was windless and weighty. We do not need more speeches. We need fewer explanations. We don't need perfection. We need posture. Someone in the 5th row bowed their head, not in shame, but in admission. An officer near the rear wiped beneath one eye quickly, hoping no one noticed. But they all did, and no one judged. Adrian gave no final flourish, no rhetorical upward inflection. Her words closed the way a gate swings shut. We do not need anyone to bow. We only need them to stand when it matters. Then she stepped back. Exactly one pace. Her hands did not lift. Her eyes did not lower. She did not acknowledge applause because there was none. The room didn't clap. It absorbed. Because some truths don't earn ovation, they earn revision. Adrian stepped back from the podium, not with closure, but with calibration, the kind of movement that doesn't signify the end of a sentence, but the transfer of its weight. The Valor Assembly did not erupt in applause. It didn't move at all, and that stillness was louder than thunder, a collective pause that dared not break what had just been rebuilt, sentence by sentence, silence by silence. The cameras held steady, scanning faces not for drama but for consequence. In the second tier of the auditorium, an instructor from a southern base clenched his hands on the armrests, white-knuckled, his mind scrawling not through Adrian's story, but through every cadet he'd ever overlooked. Beside him, a female officer closed her eyes, holding tightly to the insignia on her chest, not as pride but as proof that survival had never been enough. This wasn't a tribute, it was a turning point. Adrian had not asked for anyone to rise. And yet, people sat taller in their seats, some without realizing they had straightened their spine. The speech had ended, but its gravity hadn't. It hung over the audience like vapor from a battlefield, not choking but undeniable. When the MC stepped forward, he said nothing for several seconds. He didn't need to. Even his silence now felt borrowed, as if he were standing in the echo of something he couldn't follow. Backstage, aides whispered, but none dared speak Adrian's name. She walked past them without pause, her gaze fixed ahead, neither stiff nor ceremonial, just forward. She didn't seek the green room. She didn't wait for feedback. She had not come for a reaction. She had come to return something, a truth long buried under medals, protocol, and performance. Now that it had been laid bare, there was nothing left to carry, only to leave. As she exited the building into the gray morning light, the flags outside the auditorium stirred, not in theatrical gusts, but in steady wind. She walked alone. No cameras followed. No one stopped her. The power of her words didn't need her physical presence to linger. It had already transferred to the room behind her, to the minds now recalibrating their meaning of strength. And while valor was being rewritten inside marble walls, a very different kind of reckoning unfolded across town. Doyle sat alone in the small, dusty apartment that had become less a place of retreat and more a confessional cell without the priest. The TV flickered with the closing broadcast of the Valor Assembly, the image of Adrienne stepping off the stage rendered in soft focus. The volume had been turned low, yet every syllable had landed like confession, spoken by a woman who hadn't aimed at him, but had hit him all the same. He hadn't shaved. He hadn't eaten since morning. He wore the same uniform shirt from the day before, wrinkled and half-buttoned, his body slumped into a cheap vinyl chair, too small for comfort and too permanent for escape. The speech wasn't just something he watched, it was something that unstitched him. He didn't move when the camera panned to the crowd. He recognized one or two faces from his earlier years, names he once mocked as too soft or too formal. Now those same faces bore more weight in their silence than he had ever conjured in a shout. The screen showed the officer's lips tighten. Another blinked quickly, then squared her shoulders. These were not men and women being humbled by words. They were being restored by them. And Doyle, once a man of many declarations, could now only sit and witness the collapse of the myth he had built around his authority. He reached for the remote, hesitated, and didn't press mute. He needed to hear this, even if it was already over. He needed to sit in the quiet, with the echo of Adrienne's voice trailing like smoke into the recesses of his denial. He needed to hear what it sounded like when the system finally honored what it had once tried to destroy. The television faded to a logo. The program concluded, but Doyle did not stand. In that hour, something fractured, not with the sound of breaking, but with the recognition that he would never wear another title again, not because they had stripped it from him, but because none of it had ever been truly his. The uniform, the badge, the authority, all illusions, once shielded by noise, now exposed by silence. He looked down at his chest where a patch had once lived, and slowly, as if ceremony still mattered, he slid his fingers across the seam. Then he stood, not like Adrian, tall, unwavering. He stood like a man who no longer had a story to tell. The television screen dimmed to black. There was no final score, no anchor summarizing what had been said, no analyst breaking down the meaning. There were only those who had listened and those who had heard. Doyle sat there, staring into the void of his screen, the remote resting like a relic in his hand. The words Adrian had spoken did not play again. They didn't need to. They had carved a groove deep enough to repeat themselves without sound. Outside his window, the street buzzed faintly with late afternoon life. Cars moved. People laughed. The world continued, unapologetic, unbothered by the collapse of one man's certainty. But in that small, rented room, Doyle had not moved in nearly an hour. Something had landed that would not lift. Not guilt, not grief, something worse, recognition. Across the room, his uniform jacket still hung on a plastic hanger nailed to the wall. It looked emptier now, smaller, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The badge, no longer glinting, caught no light. Its silence accused louder than any headline ever could. Doyle stood and approached it, not as a soldier, not as a man of duty, but as someone who had once been believed, and now he didn't even believe himself. He reached up and took the jacket down. His hands didn't tremble. That had passed. He folded it once, carefully, then laid it across the arm of the chair. Not tossed, not dropped, dismissed. Then, without ceremony, he began to unbutton his shirt. Each click of the plastic echoed louder than applause ever had. He moved slowly, not for effect, but because his body had forgotten how to carry weight without title. When the shirt came off, he stood there in a plain undershirt, bare of rank, bare of assumption, bare of the illusion that his silence could ever compete with hers. He did not burn the uniform, he did not bury it. He simply didn't wear it anymore. At the same time, half a continent away, Adrian sat quietly in a corner room of the military guest quarters. Her bag was already packed, folded with the same precision she had applied to battle plans. She didn't check the news. She didn't watch the coverage. Her job had never been to linger. Her speech had done what it needed. It left no audience, only aftermath. On the small desk, a single folder sat unopened. Tomorrow, she would board a flight to another base, where another room of officers awaited her insight, not to hear what had happened, but to be reminded of what not to become. She would not reference Doyle. She would not say his name. That part of the story had closed, not with a bang, but with a buttoned shirt left on a plastic chair. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the student's letter one more time, not to reread it, but to feel its presence. She ran her fingers across the creases, soft now from being opened too often. Then she placed it back into the drawer, stood, and turned off the light. Back in the city, someone else, an officer who had been watching, stood in his living room, holding his young daughter. He did not explain what Adrian had said. He only whispered, "She was right," into her hair. Across the base, a group of cadets sat in the common room, replaying the speech, not to memorize it, but to understand how stillness could sound like command. And in a quiet corner of a retirement home, a veteran who had once been reprimanded for overstepping in a patrol dispute simply wiped a tear and muttered, "Finally." In every corner of the country, something unspoken had shifted. The speech was not historic because of the applause. It was historic because of what it no longer permitted: excuses. In the Valor Assembly Archive, the footage would be stored under the name Address by General Adrian Lane. No subtitle, no footnote, because some speeches don't need explanation. They speak louder when uncaptioned. And in the final frames of the archived footage, before the broadcast cut, there was a lingering shot. Adrian, back turned, walking off stage, the camera capturing only her silhouette against the lighted banner. In that moment, there were no more words, only weight and legacy. The footage of Adrian's final walk off stage became the last frame many would remember, not because it was dramatic, but because it needed no punctuation, no salute, no closing gesture, just the quiet retreat of a woman who had finished what she came to say. But the ripple did not end there. It expanded, like the last wave of a stormless tide, subtle but irrevocable. Institutions began to look inward. Headlines gave way to curriculum updates. Where once there had been noise, there was now recalibration. At the heart of the National Military Academy, a new memorial was installed. It wasn't grand. It didn't need gold or stone angels. It stood clean, black marble, set at eye level, etched into its surface in brushed steel. Silence is the weapon of those who no longer need to shout. No name, no title, no plaque of events. Because history, when earned in silence, writes itself not in chapters, but in shifts, and the shift had already happened. Cadets passed the memorial daily. Some nodded, some paused, some just breathed slower. They understood this was not a site to worship, but a point to recalibrate from, a reminder that command does not rise from volume, but from gravity. Across the country, the final news segment aired. It was not dramatized. It did not end with swelling music or scrolls of commentary. It ended with a single phrase, spoken by the anchor, in a voice more still than sentimental. A woman who didn't fight back with her voice, only her stature. Far from the monument, far from the ceremony, far from the institution that had once doubted her rank, Adrienne stood in her modest room, facing a wardrobe that had followed her across deployments, investigations, tribunals, and decades of command. Hanging inside, crisp as always, was the uniform, unfaded, unbent. The medals still gleamed, but they no longer felt necessary. She reached in and took it down. Her fingers moved with neither hesitation nor nostalgia. This was not a ritual of goodbye. It was clarity. She laid the uniform across the bed, smooth, flat, aligned, then stepped back and looked at it not as an artifact, but as an old language she had finally translated. Without a word, she lifted it once more, hung it back on the rack, and closed the door. That gesture, quiet, final, was not broadcast. No journalist recorded it. No caption followed. But somehow the silence it created was louder than anything she had ever said. It didn't signal surrender. It signaled completion. Meanwhile, in another part of the country, in a town neither proud nor hostile, Doyle left. No departure form, no escort, no press. Just a man with a bag, a fading ID, and a story no one asked for. He passed through the station gates unnoticed. The guards didn't speak. The clerk didn't lift her eyes. In the streets, no one turned their head. There was no destination, only distance. From the place where he had once shouted, from the badge he had once believed made him untouchable, from the silence that had swallowed him whole and left him standing, echoless. He walked into that distance not as a fugitive, not as a repentant man, but as someone the world had finally outgrown. He didn't carry shame. He carried irrelevance. And that, in the end, was more exiling than any verdict. No one cared to exile him. He simply faded. No articles would mention where Doyle went. No final interview would be requested. And no chair would be left empty in his honor, because he hadn't just fallen. He had unanchored himself from every system that once pretended he mattered. One symbol buried with full honor, silence, and a closed door. One symbol disappeared, not with scandal, but with omission. The news cycle wound down. Nothing new emerged because there was nothing left to say. For once, the silence wasn't absence, it was aftermath. In press rooms, reporters closed tabs they no longer needed to refresh. In conference halls, officials adjusted language in their policies, not to appease outrage, but because the silence had made old rhetoric sound juvenile. The story hadn't ended with flames or trials. It had ended because Adrienne Lane had walked off stage, and no one had dared step where she had stood. Within the academy, a whiteboard once used to list training rotations now bore a single handwritten message. You don't need to yell to make others listen. No one erased it, no one signed it, but instructors began referencing it. In debriefs, it became a question. Did your decision require shouting, or did it deserve attention? A shift, subtle yet seismic, began rewriting the culture, not in command manuals but in conversation tone. At night, in barracks and dorms, young cadets spoke of her like folklore, but not myth. She was real, that was the point. Real, composed, and untouchable, not because she sought power, but because she understood exactly when not to wield it. She had dismantled arrogance with presence, not performance, and her greatest weapon had never been her rank, it was her restraint. Elsewhere, someone tried to revive Doyle's name for a segment. An op-ed draft circulated, pitching a look back at the man at the center of it all. The editor returned it with a note, "He's not the center. Not anymore. He's a footnote that never mattered." The story of Doyle had shrunk from controversy to a cautionary tale, from antagonist to absence. He was not discussed in terms of misconduct or redemption. He was referenced as erosion, what happens when someone confuses voice with value and loses both. The apartment Doyle stayed in grew smaller, not in size, but in presence. He left no trace in the building. No neighbors remembered his name. No landlord recalled his application. It was as if he had dissolved quietly into a system that had stopped needing him. He had once roared through his job like a man too loud to ignore. Now he couldn't get the mail without feeling watched. Not from accusation, but from indifference. He turned on the television once. A rerun of Adrian's speech flickered for a moment. He turned it off mid-sentence, not out of bitterness, out of inability. The sound of that voice, steady and unimpressed, had become too much for a man who had once demanded applause for arresting silence. Now he lived inside its consequence. Meanwhile, Adrienne didn't speak of Doyle again. When asked by cadets what leadership meant, she simply said, "It's knowing when silence becomes the last word." She did not name him. She did not dissect his failures, because to do so would be to reignite a flame that she had already let extinguish on its own. Her power was never to defeat him, it was to make the world stop pretending he was worth fearing. As the Academy's new semester began, the whiteboard remained, still legible, still untouched, and in the subtle glances between instructors and students, a new kind of respect emerged, not the kind earned through hierarchy, but through example. Adrienne had become the metric, the mirror, not for what to be, but for what not to betray. The monument remained unchanged. Visitors stood in front of it in silence. No tours narrated their meaning, no plaque explained its context, because the context was lived in the room, in every quiet decision not to escalate, in every correction delivered without noise, in every room where Doyle's ghost used to echo. Now there was just quiet, and still no one spoke her name aloud at the monument, because names fade, but impressions, when carved into the behavior of a generation, outlast their syllables. No national holiday was declared, no medals reissued, no grand ceremony ensued, but what had happened within systems, inside syllabi, behind closed training doors, was more permanent than any brass-plated moment. It wasn't that Adrienne had spoken louder than those before her, it was that she'd stood, unshaken, where everyone else would have demanded to shout. And systems remembered that, not because it was dramatic, but because it was irrefutable. Doyle, meanwhile, began to disappear from the few places he once lingered. The blurry footage of his old broadcasts got removed from training reels. Public records flagged his name not as criminal, but as cautionary. He wasn't erased, that would have given him infamy. He was absorbed into the category of what we've moved past. Students no longer asked, "What happened to him?" They asked, "How did he last so long without being seen?" The answer came without speeches. It came in policy briefings, in departmental ethics revisions, in internal memos that now used Adrienne's case not as a scandal, but as a precedent. A new column was added in personnel evaluations, response to restraint. What had once been measured in arrests was now being weighed in silence, because Adrienne had shown restraint not as a weakness, but as a calculation, a refusal to rise to the bait. a dominance that didn't need an audience. And then came the final closure, the kind no camera catches. In a lecture to a small group of mid-level officers, Adrienne was asked by a younger captain, "Do you regret not pushing harder for a harsher punishment?" Her answer was direct. Punishment doesn't always rewire behavior. Sometimes indifference does. The room stayed still. It was not a dismissal of justice. It was an elevation of consequence. She hadn't destroyed Doyle. She had allowed the truth to reveal him, and when systems see clearly, they rarely forget. In a quiet corner of the same building, an instructor replaced an old quote above a training doorway. It once read, "Lead with command." Now it read, "Command without needing to lead." Subtle, almost indistinguishable, but those who noticed understood what it meant. Adrienne's uniform remained untouched since that final day she closed the wardrobe. She hadn't retired it in ceremony. She had released it in principle. She knew its value was not in wearing it again, but in knowing she never had to prove she earned it. And in that release, she had disarmed every badge that had ever tried to shout louder than integrity. Doyle, in his obscurity, received a final letter from a former colleague. It was unsigned. It said only, "We don't miss your voice. We remember her silence." He didn't reply. He didn't know how, because there are moments when the weight of a single sentence is enough to end a whole persona. Back at the academy, the whiteboard remained, still, undefiled, still legible after all these months. You don't need to yell to make others listen. Students now refer to it as the first rule, not by mandate but by respect. No one wrote under it. No one erased it. It had become less of a sentence and more of a compass. And compasses don't need decoration. They only need to point true. What Adrienne had given them wasn't victory. It was a new center of gravity. She had not demanded a change. She had demonstrated it. She had not conquered Doyle. She had outlived his echo. She had not worn power like a weapon. She had worn it like silence wears a room. Unchallenged, undoubted, unmistakable. The seasons turned, news cycles moved on, politics shifted, wars were waged, and elections contested. But one thing stayed, a monument, subtle in design, but seismic in its presence. It stood at the edge of the academy grounds, not fenced, not guarded, simply there. A brushed steel plaque mounted to stone, no name etched on it, just one line: "Silence is the weapon of those who never needed to scream." No ceremony was held for its unveiling. Cadets were simply told, "It's ready," and they came, not for photos, not for ritual, but because they knew the story, felt the weight. Some saluted, others stood motionless, but none walked away unaffected, because what had been laid into that steel wasn't just a quote. It was a recalibration of force, of respect, of what it meant to hold power and not abuse it. Adrienne never visited the monument. She didn't need to. The lesson was never about her presence. It was about the space she had created, so wide, so disciplined, that others could step in and rise. She had lit the path, then stepped aside. That was her last command. Elsewhere, in a crumbling suburb forgotten by every map, Doyle packed his last box. No one had come to say goodbye. No landlord asked where he was going. The cab driver didn't offer to help with his luggage. It was the kind of exit reserved for those who'd overstayed in every sense. Not dramatic, not tragic, just unnoticed. He left no forwarding address because no one would write. He deleted his last social account, not because of trolls or threats, but because silence had become unbearable. It no longer felt like solitude. It felt like a sentence. In the academy's main lecture hall, a new generation of officers graduated. The final slide in the orientation deck had no bullet points, just a single line, handwritten in black ink. "You don't need to yell to make others silent." The instructor let it sit there, projected against the wall, unsaid. Then the lights came back on. Somewhere in her home, Adrienne placed her hand on the uniform one last time. It hung clean, pressed, and undisturbed. She didn't wear it. She didn't fold it away. She simply touched it, then shut the wardrobe door. Not a ritual, not nostalgia, just finality. In the newsroom, one last article was cued. The headline read, "She never raised her voice. She changed the system anyway." It wasn't flashy, it didn't go viral, but it was clipped and posted on more department walls than any editorial that year. And in one classroom, during one quiet lesson, a young instructor paused mid-sentence and pointed to the whiteboard. "That line," he said, "that's the legacy." The cadets nodded. No applause, no questions, just understand. In the silence that followed, something settled, not just in that room, in the country, in a culture that had for too long equated volume with truth, uniformity with virtue, and noise with authority. Adrienne Lane had dismantled all that with one act. She had not fought back. She had stood still, and the world had moved around her. There was no grave for her legacy. It didn't need one. It was alive, stitched into ethos, etched into quiet rules, carried in the posture of cadets who now stood straighter, not out of fear, but out of pride. As for Doyle, his name became a whisper that never caught wind. He wasn't erased. He was simply unneeded. And in the end, that was worse than punishment. It was oblivion.